January 24th, 44 AD. The marble corridors of the Palatine Palace echoed with screams that would end the reign of Rome's most deranged emperor. Blood pooled beneath the purple robes of Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, known to history as Caligula. The Praetorian guards, who had sworn to protect him, now stood over his mutilated corpse, their swords dripping with imperial blood. But this was not murder. This was liberation. For 4 years, Rome had endured the unthinkable under this man who claimed to be a living god. He had turned the Senate into his personal theater of humiliation, forcing noble senators to run alongside his chariot like common slaves. He declared war on Neptune himself, ordering his legions to collect seashells as spoils of victory against the sea god. But perhaps most shocking of all, he committed acts so depraved that even ancient Roman historians struggled to record them. This is the story of how a beloved young prince became history's most notorious tyrant. A man who didn't just break the laws of Rome, but shattered every boundary of human decency. He made his horse a consul of the Roman Empire and claimed it as his spouse in a grotesque ceremony that mocked both marriage and governance. He turned his own sisters into his lovers, defying not just Roman law, but the most fundamental taboos of human civilization. When one sister dared to resist, he had her executed, then declared her a goddess and built temples in her honor. He bankrupted the richest empire on earth within 2 years, spending Rome's treasury on golden statues of himself and floating bridges built solely for his amusement. He ordered random executions during gladiator games, pointing his finger at spectators and watching them die for his entertainment. But how does a young man, once loved by the Roman people, transform into such a monster? The answer lies in a childhood forged by trauma, paranoia, and the corrupting influence of absolute power. This is not just the story of one mad emperor. This is a warning about what happens when unchecked power meets a mind already fractured by cruelty and betrayal. Welcome to the reign of Caligula, where the line between civilization and savagery disappeared entirely, where the ruler of the known world became its greatest threat, and where the price of madness was paid in Roman blood. 1. Rise to power. The deceiving hope. March 16th. 37 AD. The island fortress of Capri, where Emperor Tiberius had ruled Rome in self-imposed exile for the past 11 years. The 77-year-old emperor lay dying in his marble palace, his paranoid reign finally coming to an end. For 2 decades, Tiberius had terrorized Rome's elite with treason trials and executions, turning the empire into a police state ruled by fear. But as death approached, all eyes turned to his chosen heir, 24-year-old Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. The young man, known as Caligula, had survived where others had perished, navigating the treacherous waters of imperial politics with remarkable skill. Born into the legendary Julio-Claudian dynasty, he carried the bloodline of Julius Caesar and Augustus himself. His father, Germanicus, had been Rome's most beloved general until his mysterious death, possibly by poison ordered by Tiberius. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, had died in exile, starved to death on a barren island after daring to oppose the emperor. His brothers had met similar fates. Nero Caesar executed, Drusus Caesar imprisoned and tortured until he ate the stuffing from his mattress to survive. Yet somehow, Caligula had not only survived, but thrived under Tiberius's watchful eye. When news of Tiberius's death reached Rome, the city erupted in celebration unlike anything seen in generations. Citizens poured into the streets chanting "Tiberius to the Tiber," demanding the hated emperor's body be thrown into the river. But their joy was not just about Tiberius's death. It was about the promise of his successor. Caligula represented everything Romans had longed for during the dark years of Tiberius's reign. He was young, charismatic, and carried the beloved name of his father Germanicus. The Senate unanimously voted to grant him all imperial powers, something that had never happened so quickly in Roman history. The Praetorian Guard, who controlled the succession, had chosen wisely, or so it seemed. When Caligula entered Rome for the first time as emperor, the reception was unprecedented. Crowds lined the streets for miles, throwing flowers and shouting his name with genuine adoration. Veterans who had served under his father wept openly, seeing in the young emperor the return of better days. The first 8 months of Caligula's reign seemed to justify every hope the Roman people had placed in him. He immediately recalled all political exiles, allowing families torn apart by Tiberius's paranoia to reunite. He distributed massive bonuses to the Praetorian Guard, the legions, and even ordinary citizens, earning their unwavering loyalty. Public games and spectacles returned to Rome after years of Tiberius's austere rule, and the people celebrated their young emperor's generosity. He completed construction projects that Tiberius had abandoned, providing work for thousands of unemployed Romans. Most importantly, he appeared to govern with wisdom beyond his years, consulting the Senate and respecting republican traditions. Ancient historians recorded that these early months showed a ruler of exceptional promise, combining the military genius of his father with the political acumen of Augustus. But then, in October of 37 AD, something changed dramatically. Caligula fell seriously ill with what historians believe was either encephalitis or a severe nervous breakdown. For days, he lay near death while Rome held its breath, praying for their beloved emperor's recovery. When he finally emerged from his sick bed, the man who returned was not the same person who had fallen ill. The change was so dramatic that even his closest advisors noticed immediately. Where once there had been wisdom, there was now erratic behavior and sudden rages. Where once there had been respect for tradition, there was now contempt for every Roman custom. The transformation was so complete that some historians have suggested he may have suffered brain damage from the illness. Others believe the stress of absolute power, combined with the trauma of watching his family destroyed, had finally broken his mind. Whatever the cause, the 8 months of hope were over. The monster that would terrorize Rome for the next 3 years had been born, and the Roman people, who had celebrated his rise with such joy, would soon learn the terrible price of placing their faith in the wrong man. 2. Transformation into tyranny. October 37th. AD marked the death of the beloved emperor and the birth of Rome's most terrifying tyrant. The man who emerged from his mysterious illness was unrecognizable from the wise young ruler who had captivated Rome just months before. Suetonius, the ancient historian, recorded that Caligula's transformation was so complete that Romans began to whisper he had been possessed by demons. The first sign of change came during a Senate meeting when Caligula suddenly stood and declared himself no longer bound by human laws. He announced to the stunned senators that he was not merely their emperor, but a living god who deserved worship equal to Jupiter himself. This wasn't mere megalomania. Caligula began constructing elaborate temples dedicated to his own divinity throughout the empire. He commissioned massive golden statues of himself, some reaching 30 feet in height, to be placed in sacred temples across Rome. The statue of Jupiter in his own temple was ordered to be replaced with Caligula's likeness, crowned with real jewels worth more than entire provinces. Citizens were forced to make sacrifices to Emperor Caligula, as they would to traditional gods, with priests appointed specifically to worship him. Anyone who refused to acknowledge his divinity faced immediate execution, their property confiscated, and families exiled. But divine status required divine luxury, and Caligula's spending became legendary for its excess. In his first year alone after recovering from illness, he spent the entire Roman treasury, a sum that had taken Augustus decades to accumulate. He constructed a floating bridge across the Bay of Naples, stretching over 3 miles, simply so he could ride across it wearing Alexander the Great's breastplate. The project required hundreds of ships and thousands of workers, costing more than feeding the entire city of Rome for a year. He built temporary palaces for single banquets, structures of marble and gold that were demolished immediately after use. His personal barge on Lake Nemi featured gem-encrusted decorations and floors of precious stones, serving as a floating temple to his own magnificence. Most infamously, he began construction of a bridge connecting his palace to the Temple of Jupiter, claiming he needed a direct path to visit his brother god. When the treasury ran empty, Caligula devised increasingly creative and brutal methods to fund his lifestyle. He revived the treason trials that had made Tiberius so hated, but with a crucial difference: the definitions of treason became impossibly broad. Looking at the emperor wrong could be considered treasonous. Failing to laugh at his jokes was a capital offense. Wealthy Romans lived in constant fear, knowing that any day they might be accused, executed, and their fortunes seized. The emperor's paranoia extended especially to his own family members, who represented the greatest threat to his power. His uncle Claudius, who would later become emperor, was forced to grovel and play the fool to avoid execution. Caligula's own cousin, Tiberius Gemellus, who had been named co-heir by the previous emperor, was forced to commit suicide on trumped-up charges. The systematic elimination of potential rivals became Caligula's obsession, as he saw enemies and conspirators in every shadow. His grandmother, Antonia Minor, one of the most respected women in Rome, was driven to suicide by his constant humiliation and threats. Marcus Junius Silanus, his father-in-law, was forced to cut his own throat with a razor rather than face public execution. The Praetorian prefect Macro, who had helped him secure the throne, was executed along with his wife on fabricated charges of conspiracy. Even senators who had voted him honors were later killed for excessive flattery, which Caligula claimed proved they were plotting against him. The reign of terror reached such intensity that wealthy Romans began fleeing the city, abandoning their properties rather than risk facing the emperor's wrath. Foreign ambassadors reported back to their kingdoms that Rome had become a madhouse, ruled by a lunatic who believed himself divine. The Roman army, once disciplined and professional, was forced to participate in bizarre ceremonies, worshiping their commander-in-chief as a god. Military tribunes who showed any reluctance were publicly executed, their heads displayed on spikes as warnings to others. The transformation was so complete that within 18 months of his illness, Caligula had undone decades of careful governance. Rome's allies began questioning their loyalty to an empire ruled by madness, while enemies saw opportunity in the chaos. The Roman people, who had celebrated his rise with such enthusiasm, now lived in constant fear of their own emperor. What had begun as hope for a golden age had become a nightmare from which Rome seemed unable to wake. The beloved prince had become the monster that parents used to frighten disobedient children. And this was only the beginning. The worst of Caligula's reign was yet to come. 3. Peak of cruelty. By 38 AD, Caligula's descent into madness had reached depths that shocked even the Romans, who were no strangers to imperial excess. What happened next would cement his reputation as history's most depraved ruler, crossing boundaries that civilized society had never imagined possible. The emperor's relationship with his three sisters, Agrippina the Younger, Julia Livilla, and Julia Drusilla, had always been unusually close. But according to Suetonius and other contemporary historians, Caligula transformed these familial bonds into something far more sinister and taboo. Ancient sources record that he began engaging in incestuous relationships with all three of his sisters, treating them as his personal concubines. At official banquets, he would openly fondle his sisters while dining with foreign dignitaries and Roman senators. These weren't mere rumors or political slander. Multiple independent sources documented these shocking displays of imperial depravity. Guests at imperial dinners reported being forced to watch as Caligula publicly violated every sacred law of Roman society. The emperor seemed to take perverse pleasure in forcing Rome's elite to witness his transgressions, daring anyone to object. Of his three sisters, Julia Drusilla held a special place in Caligula's twisted affections. She was not merely his sister and lover, but according to historical accounts, his obsession and the closest thing to a wife he ever truly acknowledged. Caligula showered Drusilla with unprecedented honors, naming her heir to his property and treating her as his empress in all but name. He had coins minted bearing her image alongside his own, a privilege previously reserved only for emperors and their legitimate wives. But Drusilla's privileged position would ultimately lead to her destruction, as she began to resist her brother's increasingly demanding and degrading treatment. In June of 38 AD, Julia Drusilla died under mysterious circumstances at the age of just 22. Official records claim she died of fever, but many historians suspect Caligula had her murdered when she threatened to expose his crimes or attempted to escape his control. The emperor's reaction to Drusilla's death revealed the full extent of his madness and the depths of his narcissistic obsession. Rather than mourn her as a sister, Caligula declared Julia Drusilla to be a goddess, ordering the construction of temples in her honor throughout the empire. He established a new religious cult dedicated to worshipping Drusilla as Diva Drusilla, complete with priests, ceremonies, and mandatory sacrifices. Citizens were required to swear oaths by Drusilla's divinity, and anyone who refused to acknowledge her goddess status faced execution. Statues of the deified Drusilla were placed in every major temple, often positioned to receive more prominent worship than traditional Roman gods. Caligula himself served as the high priest of his sister's cult, conducting elaborate ceremonies that combined religious ritual with his own megalomania. But perhaps the most infamous example of Caligula's complete break from reality involved his beloved horse, Incitatus. This wasn't merely the story of an emperor who loved his horse. It was a deliberate assault on Roman dignity and governmental tradition. Incitatus lived in a marble stable with an ivory manger, purple blankets, and a collar of precious stones worth more than most senators' annual income. The horse had its own house, complete with furniture and slaves, and dinner guests were invited to dine with Incitatus at formal banquets. According to Suetonius, Caligula spoke to his horse as if it were human, conducting conversations and claiming to receive political advice from the animal. Most shocking of all, historical sources record that Caligula conducted a formal marriage ceremony with Incitatus, declaring the horse to be his spouse. The wedding was conducted with all the pomp and ceremony of a traditional Roman marriage, complete with witnesses from the Senate and Praetorian Guard. Guests were forced to attend and participate in this grotesque parody of marriage, treating the union as if it were legitimate. The emperor's relationship with his horsewife became a symbol of how completely he had abandoned human reason and social norms. But Caligula's elevation of Incitatus went beyond mere eccentricity. It was a calculated humiliation of Roman institutions. He appointed the horse to the highest offices in the Roman government, making Incitatus a consul of the Roman Empire. This meant that a horse now held one of the most prestigious positions in Roman politics, theoretically outranking every human senator. Incitatus was also made a priest in the religious hierarchy, giving the animal authority over sacred Roman ceremonies. The horse received a senatorial salary and was consulted on matters of state policy, with Caligula claiming to implement Incitatus's decisions. Roman citizens were expected to show the same respect to the horse consul as they would to any human official, bowing and offering formal greetings. These appointments weren't just the acts of a madman, they were deliberate insults designed to demonstrate Caligula's absolute power over Roman society. By making a horse superior in rank to Rome's most distinguished citizens, Caligula showed that he could reduce human dignity to nothing more than his personal amusement. The message was clear. If he could make Romans bow to a horse, there was no limit to the degradation he could impose. Foreign ambassadors reported back to their kingdoms that Rome was now governed by an emperor who consulted a horse and worshipped his dead sister as a goddess. The Roman Empire, which had once been synonymous with order and civilization, had become a laughingstock ruled by madness. Yet none dared to laugh, for Caligula's cruelty toward those who displeased him had become legendary even by Roman standards. The peak of his reign had become the nadir of human decency, and still, the worst was yet to come. 4. Downfall of the Mad Emperor. By January 41st AD, even the most loyal supporters of Caligula had reached their breaking point after nearly 4 years of unimaginable tyranny. The emperor's reign of terror had created enemies in every corner of Roman society, from the Senate to the streets, but most dangerously among his own bodyguards. The Praetorian Guard, the elite military unit sworn to protect the emperor's life, had witnessed firsthand the depths of Caligula's madness and cruelty. These were hardened soldiers who had served under multiple emperors, but never had they seen such systematic degradation of Roman values and institutions. The final straw came when Caligula began openly mocking and humiliating the very men charged with his protection. He forced Praetorian officers to perform demeaning tasks, making them serve as waiters at his banquets and personal servants to his horse Incitatus. The emperor delighted in giving the guards passwords that were designed to humiliate them, using obscene phrases and the names of his sisters as military commands. Most insultingly, he questioned their courage and masculinity in front of foreign dignitaries, calling them cowards and weaklings. Among the Praetorian Guard, one man stood out as particularly outraged by the emperor's behavior: Cassius Chaerea, a seasoned military tribune. Chaerea was a veteran of Germanic campaigns, a man whose loyalty to Rome ran deeper than his oath to any individual emperor. He had served with distinction for decades, earning the respect of his fellow soldiers through courage in battle and integrity in peacetime. But Caligula had singled out Chaerea for special humiliation, mocking the tribune's high-pitched voice and questioning his manhood repeatedly. The emperor would force Chaerea to use embarrassing passwords like Priapus and Venus, sexual references designed to demean the proud soldier. During official ceremonies, Caligula would publicly ridicule Chaerea's appearance and mannerisms, reducing a respected officer to an object of imperial amusement. For a Roman soldier whose honor meant everything, these insults were not just personal affronts, but attacks on the dignity of Rome itself. Chaerea began quietly approaching other members of the Praetorian Guard, testing their loyalty to the increasingly unstable emperor. He discovered that his disgust with Caligula was widely shared among the guards, who had grown tired of protecting a man they viewed as Rome's greatest enemy. The conspiracy grew to include key figures from across Roman society: senators who had lost family members to Caligula's paranoia, freedmen who had witnessed his cruelties, and military officers who feared for Rome's future. Cornelius Sabinus, another Praetorian tribune, joined the plot, bringing with him a network of loyal soldiers ready to act. Even some of Caligula's personal servants were recruited, providing crucial intelligence about the emperor's daily routines and security arrangements. The conspirators chose January 24th, 41 AD, as the date for their action, during the Palatine Games when Caligula would be attending theatrical performances. The plan was simple but required perfect timing. They would strike during the emperor's return from the theater, in the narrow underground corridors of the palace. On the morning of January 24th, omens appeared that seemed to predict the emperor's doom, though Caligula ignored every warning sign. A sacrifice revealed unfavorable entrails, and the emperor's soothsayers advised him to cancel all public appearances for the day. But Caligula, in his arrogance, dismissed these concerns and proceeded with his planned attendance at the games. As the theatrical performances continued, the conspirators took their positions throughout the palace complex, each man knowing that discovery meant certain death. Around midday, Caligula decided to return to his palace for lunch, taking his usual route through the Cryptoporticus, the underground tunnel system. This narrow, dimly lit corridor, would become the tomb of Rome's most hated emperor. Cassius Chaerea and his fellow conspirators waited in the shadows as Caligula approached, accompanied by only a small retinue of servants and guards. As the emperor passed through the confined space, Chaerea struck the first blow, driving his sword deep into Caligula's shoulder. The emperor cried out, "I am still alive!" But the conspirators showed no mercy for the man who had shown none to Rome. Multiple assassins surrounded Caligula, stabbing him repeatedly with their swords until his purple robes were soaked in imperial blood. Historical accounts record that Caligula received over 30 wounds, each conspirator ensuring they played a part in ending the tyrant's reign. The emperor, who had claimed to be a living god, died like any mortal man, bleeding out on the cold marble floor of his own palace. But the conspirators' work was not finished. They also murdered Caligula's wife Caesonia and brutally killed his infant daughter by smashing her head against a wall. This horrific act was designed to prevent any future claims of legitimacy from Caligula's bloodline, ensuring the complete destruction of his dynasty. When news of the assassination spread throughout Rome, the initial reaction was not grief, but celebration tempered by fear of civil war. Citizens who had lived in terror for 4 years finally dared to speak openly about their relief at the tyrant's death. Statues of Caligula were torn down and destroyed throughout the city, as Romans sought to erase every trace of his reign from public memory. The Senate initially attempted to restore the Roman Republic, but their efforts collapsed within hours due to lack of popular support and military backing. Instead, the Praetorian Guard proclaimed Caligula's uncle Claudius as the new emperor, finding him hiding behind curtains in the palace, terrified for his own life. The aftermath of Caligula's 4-year reign revealed the devastating damage one mad emperor could inflict on the world's greatest empire. The imperial treasury, once the envy of the ancient world, had been completely bankrupted by his extravagant spending and wasteful projects. Rome's military reputation had been damaged by Caligula's bizarre campaigns and his treatment of seasoned officers as personal servants. The empire's diplomatic relationships had been strained to breaking point by the emperor's erratic behavior and insulting treatment of foreign ambassadors. Most seriously, the precedent of imperial assassination had been established, creating a pattern that would haunt Roman politics for centuries to come. Future emperors would live in constant fear of their own guards, knowing that the very men sworn to protect them had once murdered their predecessor. The Roman people had learned that absolute power, when placed in the hands of a madman, could transform civilization itself into a nightmare. Caligula's reign served as an eternal warning that the corruption of power knows no bounds, and that even the mightiest empire can be brought to its knees by the madness of one man. His death marked not just the end of a tyrant, but the beginning of a new understanding of how fragile the foundations of civilization truly are. The boy who had been loved as Rome's hope had become the monster whose death was Rome's salvation. Conclusion: the legacy of madness. The story of Caligula stands as one of history's most disturbing examples of how absolute power can corrupt absolutely. In just 4 years, this young man transformed from Rome's beloved hope into its most feared nightmare, leaving scars on the empire that would never fully heal. His reign demonstrated that even the world's most powerful civilization was vulnerable to the whims of a single madman. The historical records of Suetonius, Cassius Dio, and Josephus paint a consistent picture of a ruler who abandoned every principle of human decency. These weren't mere political exaggerations or enemy propaganda. Multiple independent sources documented the same horrifying patterns of behavior. Archaeological evidence supports these accounts. Coins bearing Drusilla's image as a goddess, ruins of temples built for Caligula's worship, and inscriptions proclaiming his divinity. The man who married his horse and proclaimed himself a living god wasn't just mentally ill. He was a cautionary tale about unchecked authority. Caligula's transformation from beloved prince to despised tyrant reveals the dangerous fragility of democratic institutions when faced with authoritarian madness. His systematic destruction of Roman traditions, making a horse a consul, forcing senators to worship him, turning the treasury into his personal piggy bank, showed how quickly civilization can crumble. The incestuous relationships with his sisters weren't just personal scandals, but deliberate violations of society's most sacred taboos designed to demonstrate that no law could constrain him. Even his method of governing through fear and humiliation created a template that future tyrants would follow throughout history. The Praetorian Guard's assassination of Caligula established a precedent that would haunt Rome for centuries, the idea that emperors could be removed by military force. This single act of liberation became a curse, as subsequent rulers lived in constant fear of their own protectors. The empire's recovery under Claudius proved that Rome's institutions were stronger than any individual, but the damage to imperial prestige was permanent. Foreign nations had witnessed the spectacle of Rome governed by madness, and the empire's reputation for stability and order was forever tarnished. Perhaps most chilling is how Caligula's reign anticipated the patterns of modern totalitarian regimes: the personality cult, the elimination of rivals, the use of spectacle to distract from suffering. His story serves as an eternal warning that the line between civilization and barbarism is thinner than we dare imagine. When we study Caligula today, we're not just examining ancient history. We're confronting the timeless question of how power corrupts and how societies can protect themselves from their own leaders. The young man who once brought hope to millions became a monster whose death brought relief to the world. His legacy reminds us that vigilance against tyranny is the price of freedom, and that even the mightiest empires can be brought low by the madness of one man. In the end, Caligula's 4-year reign of terror lasted less than a human lifetime, but its lessons echo through the ages. The boy who should have been Rome's savior became its destroyer, proving that sometimes the greatest enemies of civilization come from within. This is the story of Caligula, a warning from history that power without restraint inevitably leads to madness, destruction, and the collapse of everything we hold dear. Remember his name not as a ruler to be admired, but as a cautionary tale of what happens when absolute power meets absolute corruption. For in the end, the most terrifying tyrants are not those who seize power through force, but those who inherit it through trust and then betray that trust in the most unimaginable ways. The death of Caligula was not just the end of a reign of terror, it was a reminder that even in the darkest times, human dignity and decency will ultimately prevail over madness and cruelty.